The door to the marshal's office swung open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and the sound of it echoed down the main street of Redemption Creek like a gunshot on a Sunday morning. Every head turned. Every conversation died. Walter Sutton stood in the doorway of his office with his badge catching the blazing Arizona sun of 1882, his jaw set like iron, his dark eyes burning with the kind of cold fury that men who had known him for years understood meant something far beyond ordinary anger. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with the lean economy of movement that came from a decade of wearing a lawman's star in rough country. And right now he was looking at Clement Farrow, land agent for the Continental Acquisition Company, as though the man were something he had scraped off the sole of his boot. Farrow stood in the center of the street, his expensive Eastern suit already darkened with sweat under the arms, his leather satchel clutched in both hands like a shield. He was a soft man in a hard place, and he had just made the catastrophic mistake of presenting Walter Sutton with a set of land transfer documents that were not worth the paper they had been printed on. The notary seal was wrong. The circuit judge's signature was a forgery so clumsy a blind man could have spotted it, and the acreage described in the filing would have taken in not only the homestead of a widow woman named Opal Fletcher, but 4 other family farms, the schoolhouse, and a good portion of the public well easement that the town of Redemption Creek depended on for its survival. Walter held the papers out at arm's length and let them drop into the dirt between himself and Farrow. He did not raise his voice. When Walter Sutton was truly angry, his voice dropped instead, low and deliberate as the hammer of a single-action colt being drawn back to full cock. "Come back with an honest order," Walter said, "or do not come back to this county." The silence that followed was absolute. A horse stamped one hoof somewhere down by the livery. A child on the boardwalk tugged urgently at its mother's sleeve. Clement Farrow looked down at the papers settling into the Arizona dust, then looked back up at the marshal, and the color had completely left his face. He bent to pick up the documents, gathered them with trembling hands, and walked to his waiting buggy without another word. The wheels raised a thin screen of red dust as he drove north toward the railroad depot, and Walter watched him go until the buggy was nothing but a moving speck against the white sky. Then Walter turned around and walked back inside his office and sat down at his desk and pressed both hands flat against the scarred wood surface and breathed. Because this was not only about the law. It had not been only about the law for the past 3 weeks, not since the morning Opal Fletcher had walked through that same door and laid her own papers on his desk and asked him, in the quietest and most dignified voice he had ever heard from a woman facing disaster, if there was anything that could be done. He needed to go back to that morning to understand how he had arrived at this moment. He needed to go back 37 days, in fact, to the day the Continental Acquisition Company first cast its shadow over Redemption Creek, and the day that Walter Sutton first looked up from his desk and saw Opal Fletcher standing in his doorway with the Arizona sun behind her and the whole precarious weight of her life in her hands. It had been a Thursday in late March, the air still carrying the last coolness of winter, but with the promise of the brutal summer already edging into the afternoons. Walter had been doing the one part of his work he genuinely disliked, which was paperwork. The territorial government in Prescott generated an extraordinary amount of it. He had his reading glasses on, which he removed with somewhat more speed than dignity when he heard footsteps on the boardwalk, because a man in his position had a reputation to consider. Opal Fletcher was 27 years old, and she had the particular kind of beauty that comes not from ease or pampering, but from a life lived honestly outdoors. Her hair was deep auburn, pulled back practically, with a few strands escaping along her temples. Her eyes were a shade of green that reminded Walter of bottle glass held up to sunlight, and they were currently filled with a controlled, carefully contained version of pure fear. She wore a blue calico dress that had been mended twice at the hem, and she carried a leather folder that contained, as Walter would shortly discover, every document pertaining to her homestead claim on 40 acres south of town. "Marshal Sutton," she said, "I am sorry to take up your time. I know you are a busy man." "Sit down, Miss Fletcher," he said, because he knew who she was the way a marshal knows everyone in his county. He knew her husband had died of a fever 2 winters ago, leaving her with the farm and a mortgage and the kind of solitary determination that either broke people or forged them into something extraordinary. Looking at her, he had always suspected she belonged to the second category. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and told him about the letter. The Continental Acquisition Company had been moving west for the better part of 2 years, buying up land in the territories with the kind of aggressive efficiency that the new railroad money made possible. They were not always honest about their methods. Opal had received a letter informing her that her homestead claim was being contested on the grounds of a surveying discrepancy from the original 1879 filing, and that a representative of the company would be arriving within the month to discuss the matter. The letter was polite in its language and brutal in its implications. She had gone to the county clerk and then to the county recorder, and both men had been helpful but ultimately uncertain. The law in the territories in 1882 was still a patchwork thing, and the Continental Acquisition Company had lawyers in Prescott and connections in the territorial legislature, and there were people who were afraid of them. Walter was not among those people. He took her folder of documents and went through them with the slow, methodical care that had served him well for 10 years in law enforcement, and what he found was that Opal Fletcher's claim was entirely sound. The original filing was in order. The surveying marks had been legally established. There was no legitimate discrepancy. Whatever the Continental Acquisition Company was building a case on, it was not the truth. "Your claim is valid," he told her flatly. "Every document in this folder supports it," she exhaled, and the sound of it told him how much she had been holding in. "Then why are they coming?" "Because they are betting that a woman alone does not know that, or does not have the means to fight it," he said. He said it directly, because she deserved directness, and because he could see from the set of her jaw that she would not thank him for softening it. "They are wrong on the first count. We are going to make sure they are wrong on the second." Something shifted in her expression then, something that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as though she had prepared herself for the possibility that the marshal would be sympathetic but ultimately helpless, and had not fully anticipated the alternative. She looked at him with those green eyes for a moment that lasted just slightly longer than strictly necessary, and Walter found himself acutely aware that he had not had a conversation this interesting in a very long time. "I appreciate that, Marshal," she said carefully. "Walter," he said, without entirely meaning to say it, and then added, "if we are going to be working together on this, the formality seems excessive." Her mouth curved in a way that was not quite a smile but was clearly in that vicinity. "Opal," she said. He walked her through what she needed to know. He explained the process by which the Continental Acquisition Company would likely proceed, the false survey claims, the fraudulent court orders, the pressure applied to local officials, and the timeline they would probably attempt to impose. He explained that the territorial court in Prescott was 3 days' ride away, but that Judge Harlan Weiss, who rode the Southern Circuit, was due in Redemption Creek in 6 weeks, and that if they could establish the validity of her claim before a sitting circuit court before the company acted, the matter would be essentially settled. 6 weeks. That was the window they had. What Walter did not say, and would not have been able to say clearly even to himself in those first days, was that he found reasons to stop by the Fletcher homestead with increasing frequency over the 2 weeks that followed. He told himself it was professional. He was reviewing the property boundaries with her, confirming the surveying marks, helping her gather additional supporting evidence. All of this was true. None of it was the complete truth. The complete truth was that Opal Fletcher had a way of meeting the world that Walter found quietly extraordinary. She ran her 40 acres with a competence that impressed him, not because he had expected otherwise, but because the scale of what she managed alone was substantial. She had a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show green in the late March soil, a small orchard of apple and peach trees that her late husband had planted, and 12 head of cattle that she managed with the help of one elderly ranch hand named Clarence who had been with the property since before the Fletchers bought it. She knew her land. She knew its water sources and its fence lines, and the places where the soil was good and the places where it was not, and she talked about all of it with an easy specificity that made Walter realize she had not simply survived here, but had genuinely put down roots. He noticed other things too, in the way that a man notices things about a woman when he is trying very hard to be professional and objective. He noticed that she laughed at herself when she made a mistake, with a naturalness that suggested she had no need to perform perfection for an audience. He noticed that she fed Clarence his supper before she fed herself. He noticed that she had a habit, when thinking through a difficult problem, of pressing 2 fingers lightly against her lips, as though keeping her thoughts in until she was sure of them. He noticed that she never once asked him for pity, not when she talked about her husband's death, not when she talked about the mortgage she was still working to pay down, not when she admitted that the letter from the Continental Acquisition Company had frightened her so badly that she had not slept for 2 nights before coming to see him. She stated these things as facts, not as appeals, and moved on. He was in significant trouble, and he knew it, and he did precisely nothing about it except continue visiting the Fletcher homestead on professional grounds. In the meantime, Clement Farrow arrived in Redemption Creek on the 8th of April and took a room at the Territorial Hotel on the main street. He was not alone. He had brought with him a junior associate named Davis and a surveyor named Ackerman, and the 3 of them spent the first 2 days making what were described as courtesy calls to various property owners in the southern quarter of the county. Walter heard about each of these calls within hours, because that was simply how a county of this size operated, and what he heard made his jaw tighten considerably. Farrow was not overtly threatening anyone. He was far too practiced for that. What he was doing was suggesting, in carefully chosen language, that the Continental Acquisition Company's interest in the area was substantial, that their legal team in Prescott was extensive, and that property owners who cooperated early would find the process much smoother than those who chose to contest the company's claims. He was, in other words, applying the quiet, polished pressure of institutional power against people who had little experience with it and less money to resist it. 2 families had already indicated they might accept the company's offered terms when Walter went to pay Clement Farrow a formal visit. He found the man in the hotel dining room, eating a late breakfast with an air of settled confidence, and Walter sat down across from him without being invited and put his badge on the table between them where it could be seen. "I want to be clear with you about something," Walter said. "This county operates under the law of the territory of Arizona. Any land transfer requires a legitimate court order supported by a legitimate claim. I have reviewed the existing homestead filings in this area, and I find them all to be valid. If your company has a genuine legal basis for contesting any of them, you will present that basis through the proper channels, and it will be evaluated by a sitting circuit judge. If your company does not have that basis, I would strongly advise you not to waste either of our time." Farrow had looked back at him with the careful, measuring expression of a man calculating odds. "Marshal Sutton," he said, "the Continental Acquisition Company operates entirely within the law." "I look forward to seeing the evidence of that," Walter said pleasantly, and stood up and took his badge back and left. He went directly from the hotel to the Fletcher homestead, which was not strictly required by any professional obligation, and found Opal in the yard feeding her chickens, her hair loose around her shoulders, because it was early enough in the morning that she had not yet put it up. She looked up when she heard his horse and shaded her eyes with one hand against the morning sun, and the image of her standing there with the light on her face and her hair down created a response in Walter's chest that he would have described, if asked, as acute professional concern. He told her about Farrow's arrival and his meeting at the hotel. He told her to keep all her documentation together and accessible. He told her not to speak with Farrow or any of his associates without either himself or a witness present. "You think he will come to me directly," she said. It was not a question. "I think he will try every approach available to him before resorting to the forged documents he almost certainly already has prepared," Walter said. "You are his largest obstacle. Your claim is the most clearly established. Your acreage is the most valuable, and you have the best grounds to lead a legal resistance that the other families could join." She absorbed this. She pressed those two fingers to her lips for a moment. "He is going to try to frighten me." "Yes, he is going to be disappointed," she said. Walter looked at her for a moment, at the quiet certainty in those green eyes, at the set of her chin, and felt something shift in his chest with the kind of finality that suggested it was not going to shift back. "I know," he said. Farrow came to the Fletcher homestead 4 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon when Walter was not there, and Opal met him in the yard with the same calm competence with which she apparently met everything. She let him speak. She did not agree to anything. She told him politely that she had legal advice and would be consulting it before making any decisions, and she asked him to leave her property, which, after a pause that she described to Walter later as intended to be intimidating, he did. She also remembered exactly what he had said, word for word, and repeated it to Walter that evening when he came by on his way back from checking the northern boundary markers of the county. The accuracy of her recall was impressive. Walter wrote down everything Farrow had said, because some of it constituted, in his professional opinion, something very close to coercive misrepresentation. "He told me that the surveying discrepancy had already been certified by a notary in Prescott," Opal said. "He told me it was only a matter of time before the court order came through, and that fighting it would cost more than the land was worth in legal fees." "Neither of those statements is supported by anything he could produce," Walter said, "because no legitimate certification exists. I told him I would need to see the documents before I accepted any characterization of them," Opal said. Walter looked up from his writing. "You said exactly that. More or less." She met his gaze with the faintest edge of amusement. "I may have read a few of the legal volumes my husband kept." "He was interested in property law." "Was he?" "He was a careful man," she said, and the way she said it held both genuine affection for the memory and something else, a quiet acknowledgment of a life she had moved past and was still moving past, and Walter recognized it because he understood what it meant to carry losses forward into the present without being defined by them. He walked home that night in the spring dark and thought about things that were not, strictly speaking, pertinent to the legal situation facing the homesteaders of Redemption Creek's southern quarter. The following 2 weeks were a careful and sometimes frustrating exercise in patience. Walter worked with the county recorder to compile a comprehensive file documenting the valid status of each affected homestead claim. He wrote a detailed letter to Judge Harlan Weiss advising him of the situation and requesting confirmation of his scheduled arrival date, and received a reply that confirmed the judge would reach Redemption Creek on or about the 15th of May. He made it his business to know Clement Farrow's movements within the county, which were regular and which told him that the land agent was methodically building something, preparing his approach, waiting for an opportunity. The other families were wavering. The Dunbar family, who held 30 acres adjacent to Opal's eastern boundary, were the most uncertain. Harold Dunbar was 62 and tired, and had been talking for 2 years about selling the property anyway. The Kellerman family, who had 25 acres further north, had 3 young children and a mortgage that was already struggling, and the amount the Continental Acquisition Company was offering was not insignificant if you were not thinking about what the land would be worth in 10 years rather than today. Walter understood their positions. He did not judge them for being afraid or for calculating survival. He went to each family and laid out the legal situation as clearly as he could, and what he told them was the truth, which was that if they could hold until Judge Weiss arrived, and the legitimacy of their claims was formally established in circuit court, the Continental Acquisition Company would have no legal ground to stand on and no viable path to compulsory acquisition. He told them it was a matter of 6 weeks, then 5, then 4. Opal Fletcher came with him to the Dunbar farm on the 22nd of April, because Harold Dunbar had known her husband and trusted her in a way he did not yet fully trust the Marshal, and she sat at the Dunbar kitchen table with Martha Dunbar, and talked with a directness and a warmth that Walter, watching from the doorway with his hat in his hands, found frankly extraordinary. "I know what it is to wonder if fighting is worth it," Opal said to the Dunbars. "I know what it is to lie awake at night calculating whether you have the strength for one more round, but your claim is as sound as mine, and mine is unbreakable. If we stand together, they cannot take any of it. If we scatter, they will take all of it." Harold Dunbar looked at his wife. Martha Dunbar looked at Opal. Then Martha Dunbar poured everyone more coffee and said, "Then we stand together." On the ride back toward town, Walter and Opal rode side by side in the long April afternoon light, and the silence between them was entirely comfortable, the kind that only develops between people who have spent enough time together to not need to fill every moment with words. The road ran through a corridor of cottonwood trees whose new leaves were a particular brilliant green against the red earth and the blue sky, and the horses moved at an easy walk, and Walter was aware of every inch of the distance between them. "You were remarkable in there," he said at last. She turned to look at him with an expression that was slightly surprised, as though the compliment had come from an unexpected angle. "I meant what I said," she replied. "I know you did. That is what made it remarkable." She looked ahead again, and the sunlight came through the cottonwood leaves and moved across her face, and Walter Sutton, who had spent 10 years maintaining a professional distance from every situation he found himself in, understood with complete clarity that he was not maintaining any kind of distance from this one and had not been for some time. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why are you doing this?" She turned to look at him again, and there was no coyness in the question, only a genuine and searching directness. "You could have handled this at arm's length. Written the letters, reviewed the documents, met Farrow at the hotel, and left the families to make their own decisions. That would have been well within the duties of your office, but you have been driving out to these farms, going through every document personally, coming to kitchen table conversations. That is not the minimum requirement of a marshal." Walter considered his answer. He owed her honesty, not deflection. "Because what they are doing is wrong," he said. "And because the people they are doing it to deserve better than the minimum." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That is not the whole answer," she said quietly. He did not deny it. He also did not supply the rest of the answer, not yet, because there were things that needed to be in the right order, and the land matter was not resolved, and he was not the kind of man who acted on feelings he could not back up with appropriate action. "No," he said, "it is not the whole answer." She nodded once, accepting this, and looked forward again, and they rode the rest of the way to the fork in the road where his route to town diverged from her route to the homestead, and parted with a courtesy that was entirely out of proportion to what was happening between them. 3 days later, Clement Farrow presented Walter with the fraudulent documents. He came to the marshal's office on the morning of the 25th of April with his leather satchel and his Eastern suit, and the careful confidence of a man who has been told by his employers that the local law enforcement would not be an obstacle. He laid the documents on Walter's desk with an explanatory preamble about the company's legal team and the thoroughness of their process, and Walter read them with the same slow, methodical attention he gave to everything. The notary seal was from a notary in Tucson who had died in January. Walter knew this because he knew the man slightly and had received word of his death through the territorial marshal's office. The circuit judge's signature purported to be from Judge Elias Morton, who had retired in 1881, and whose name was therefore on no current active roster of the territorial judiciary. The acreage description was accurate to the point of being clearly based on real surveys, but the legal basis for the transfer was constructed entirely from misrepresented precedents that, if you knew the actual cases, said nothing of the kind they were cited as saying. It was, in Walter's professional estimation, a contemptible piece of work, and the contempt was not merely legal. Whoever had prepared these documents had done so in the full knowledge that most of the people they would be presented to would have neither the legal knowledge nor the access to resources to challenge them. They had been designed to exploit ignorance and isolation, and they had been designed to be believed. Walter stood up. He carried the documents to the door. He let them fall into the street. He told Clement Farrow to come back with an honest order or not to come back to this county at all. And then he went inside and sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and breathed through the anger, because anger was useful in small amounts and dangerous in large ones. And what came next required clarity. What came next was 3 simultaneous actions. Walter wrote an urgent letter to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott detailing the fraudulent documents and requesting confirmation that the Continental Acquisition Company's legal filings in the territory were being reviewed. He sent a rider to Judge Weiss with a request to accelerate his arrival in Redemption Creek if at all possible, and he rode out to the Fletcher homestead to tell Opal what had happened. He found her in her kitchen, which smelled of bread baking and something herbal that he could not identify, and she listened to his account of the morning with the focused attention she gave to every piece of information that mattered to her situation. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "They will not stop," she said. "They will go to Prescott and come back with something new. Yes, that is why I have written to the territorial marshal. Will he act quickly enough? I do not know. Judge Weiss may be our better insurance." She nodded. She went to the stove and poured coffee and brought it to the table and sat down across from him, and they worked through the situation together the way they had been working through things for weeks now, with that easy collaborative clarity that had developed between them until it felt as natural as breathing. At some point in the middle of the conversation, Walter realized they had stopped talking about the land case. He was not sure exactly when it had happened. One moment they had been discussing the territorial marshal's response time, and then somehow they were talking about the winter her husband had died, and she was telling him about the particular quality of that silence, the way the house had felt different when it was only her in it, not empty exactly but reconfigured, like a room where the furniture has been moved and you keep reaching for things in the places they used to be. And he had told her about the years before Redemption Creek, about the marshal position he had held in a larger town in New Mexico territory where everything had moved too fast and the work had felt more like managing a constantly escalating crisis than like actually maintaining justice, and why he had chosen a smaller county even though it meant less prestige and less pay. "You wanted to actually know the people," she said. "Yes. So that what you did for them meant something real." "Yes." She looked at him across the table with those green eyes and the afternoon light coming through the window behind her, and Walter Sutton, who was not an impulsive man and had never in his professional life let his personal feelings lead his decisions, said, "Opal, I want to say something to you that I will completely understand if you would prefer I not say." Her expression was very still. "Then say it." "I have no business feeling the way I do about you while your property and your livelihood are under threat, and I am the law officer responsible for addressing that threat. I am aware of that. I want you to know that nothing I have done in this matter has been influenced by anything other than the fact that the law is on your side, and what the Continental Acquisition Company is doing is wrong. But when this is resolved, I would very much like to call on you properly, if that is something you would be open to." The silence that followed was the longest of Walter Sutton's adult life. Then Opal Fletcher said, "I have been wondering when you were going to get there." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with an expression that held warmth and exasperation, and something that was unmistakably happiness in approximately equal measure. "I have known since the first week," she said. "I also did not want to say anything while the situation was what it was. It seemed impractical." "It did," he agreed, "but I am glad you said it." "So am I." They sat with that for a moment, both of them aware that something had changed in the room and that the change was good, and that it was also somewhat inconvenient in terms of the timeline, because there was still a land case to resolve and a fraudulent land company to deal with and a circuit judge who was not yet here. Walter stood up after a moment and put his hat back on, and she walked him to the door, and he stopped on the threshold and looked at her. "When this is done," he said. "When this is done," she agreed. He rode back to town with the late afternoon light long and golden behind him, and a warmth in his chest that he had almost forgotten was possible. Clement Farrow did not return to Redemption Creek immediately. Walter had expected him to, had expected a second set of fraudulent documents or some new approach within days, but instead the land agent seemed to have retreated to regroup. Whether this was because he had wired his employers in the East and was waiting for instructions, or because Walter's refusal had genuinely surprised him, or because the letter to the territorial marshal's office had somehow reached him through the company's connections there, Walter was not sure. He used the time carefully. He obtained from the county recorder certified copies of every valid homestead filing in the affected area. He composed a comprehensive legal brief documenting the company's approach, the fraudulent documents, and the applicable territorial law, which he sent to 2 separate lawyers in Prescott that he trusted, requesting their review. He convened an informal meeting at the Redemption Creek schoolhouse to which he invited all the affected property owners, and he laid out the legal situation plainly and answered questions for the better part of 2 hours. The Kellerman family had come with some doubt remaining in their faces and had left, Walter thought, with their resolve solidified. The Dunbars came in already committed and served as quiet anchors for the others. There were 2 other families, the Ortega family with 15 acres and old Silas Pemberton with 10, who had been peripheral to the company's initial approach, but were legitimately threatened by the scope of the proposed acquisition, and both of them came away from the meeting, understanding clearly that their best protection was collective action and legal process. Opal sat at the front of the schoolhouse and said very little, which was unusual enough that Walter noticed it. And then he noticed that what she was doing was watching the other families and reading their hesitations, and at exactly the right moments, quietly addressing them with the kind of personal, specific reassurance that he could not have offered because he did not know these people the way she did. She knew that Rosa Ortega was worried about the children and framed her comments accordingly. She knew that Silas Pemberton was worried about looking like he was admitting weakness, and she talked about legal process in a way that framed resistance as assertiveness rather than defense. He could not stop watching her. He was aware that he was being somewhat obvious about it and made periodic efforts to look at the ceiling or the blackboard or anything else, with limited success. After the meeting, when the families had gone and they were walking out of the schoolhouse together into the mild May evening, Opal said without looking at him, "You kept looking at the blackboard." "I was thinking." "You were thinking about the blackboard." "I was attempting to give the impression of thinking about the blackboard." She laughed, a real laugh, unself-conscious and bright, and the sound of it in the quiet evening street was so pleasant that Walter stored it away with the same deliberate care with which he stored away pieces of evidence. They walked to the end of the main street and stood for a moment looking at the early stars coming out over the desert, and it would have been a very natural thing to reach over and take her hand, and Walter did not do it because the situation was not yet resolved, but he was aware of the effort the restraint required. "How long do you think we have before Farrow comes back?" she asked. "A week, maybe 2. He will have new documents by then and they will be better. His employers will not have been pleased with his first attempt. Will the new documents be provably fraudulent as well? Possibly, probably. The company has a pattern of this, but they may also have found a genuine loophole in the territorial filing procedures, something technical that they can exploit even without fabricating documents. That is the scenario I am most concerned about. What would that mean? It would mean we need Judge Weiss here before they can act on it, and it would mean the circuit court hearing needs to formally establish your claims on record. She nodded. Then she said, "My husband used to say that the difference between a problem and a disaster is whether you see it coming." He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He was also 29 years old when he died of a fever that should not have been fatal, and that was not wise, that was simply unfair. She said it without bitterness, with a matter-of-fact acceptance that was somehow more moving than bitterness would have been. "I am sorry," Walter said, and meant it in the full weight of the phrase, not as a social courtesy but as a genuine acknowledgement of loss. "Thank you," she said, and then looked up at him with those green eyes in the fading light. "I am going to be all right, you know. I have been all right. I have not needed rescuing. I know that. I am saying it because I want you to know that when this is done and you call on me properly, it is not because I am grateful to you. It is because I want you to." Walter felt something expand in his chest that had no adequate name. "That is the better reason," he said. She said good night and walked to where her horse was tied at the hitching post and rode south toward her homestead. And Walter stood and watched her go and then walked back to his office and tried to do paperwork with approximately no success. Judge Weiss sent a rider on the 4th of May with word that he could advance his circuit by 10 days, which put his arrival in Redemption Creek on or around the 9th of May, a week away. This was better than Walter had dared to hope. He wrote back immediately confirming the court date and providing his comprehensive legal brief for the judge's preparation. 2 days later, Clement Farrow returned. He came back on the 6th of May with new documents that were, as Walter had predicted, significantly better than the first set. The notary seal was from a living and apparently legitimate notary in Tucson. The judicial authorization appeared to come from a current territorial justice of the peace rather than a circuit judge, which suggested the company had found a more legally defensible process path. The underlying claim of surveying discrepancy was supported by a detailed technical report from a surveying company out of Phoenix. Walter sat with the documents for 2 hours and then sent a telegram to the Arizona Territorial Land Office in Prescott requesting records on the surveying company cited in the report. While he waited for the response, he went to see Opal. He found her at her fence line, replacing a section of post that had rotted over the winter, and he helped her with it while he told her about the new documents, because it was a 2-person job and Clarence was off mending tack, and it seemed foolish to stand there watching her struggle with a fence post when he had 2 functional arms. They worked together in the warm May sunshine, and when the post was in and tamped solid, Opal straightened up and pushed her hair back from her face with her forearm and looked at him with an expression that was evaluating the situation rather than showing fear. "They have been more careful this time," she said. "Yes. But careful is not the same as legitimate. The surveying company they cite in the report was incorporated 18 months ago. I would be very surprised if their records show the kind of historical survey work the report claims they are drawing on. When will you hear back from Prescott? Tomorrow or the day after?" She nodded. Then she looked out over her land, the 40 acres that she had been working for 3 years, the kitchen garden and the orchard and the grazing land and the small creek at the southern boundary that made the whole operation viable in a country where water was everything. Walter looked at it with her, seeing what she saw, the hours of work laid down in the soil, the plans mapped and carried out, the future built one season at a time. "I will not lose this," she said quietly, "not as a wish, as a statement of fact." "No," he agreed, "you will not." She turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her expression soften in a way that was not weakness but something far better than that. She reached out and put her hand briefly against his arm, just for a moment, just the warm, certain pressure of it, and then she stepped back and said, "Come inside. I will make supper." He stayed for supper. He helped her carry water from the well, and she made a beef stew with biscuits from a recipe that had apparently originated with her grandmother in Missouri. And Clarence ate with them, at the kitchen table, and told stories about the territory in the 1860s that were alternately horrifying and genuinely funny. And Walter sat in the warm lamplight of Opal Fletcher's kitchen, and thought that he could not remember the last time he had felt this at home somewhere. After Clarence went to his bunk and the supper things were washed, Opal and Walter sat on the porch in the warm May night, and the stars over the Arizona desert were extraordinary, the kind of sky that existed nowhere back east, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with land agents or legal briefs. She asked him where he was from originally, and he told her about Missouri, which was where she was from too, a coincidence that seemed to please both of them more than was perhaps warranted. He asked her how she had ended up in Arizona, and she told him about following her husband's conviction that the territories offered opportunities the settled East no longer did, and about arriving in Redemption Creek 7 years ago as a 20-year-old bride with all her belongings in a single trunk and finding, to her considerable surprise, that she loved it. Even now, he asked, after everything. She considered this with genuine seriousness, not as a rhetorical question but as a real one that deserved a real answer. "Especially now," she said. "It is mine, all of it, the difficulties included. There is something about a place you have fought for." He thought about Redemption Creek, about the 10 years he had spent in this county learning every road and every family and every source of water and trouble, and understood exactly what she meant. The telegram from Prescott arrived the next morning and confirmed everything Walter had suspected. The surveying company listed in Farrow's report had been incorporated in 1880 and had no record of any surveys conducted before that date. The historical surveys they claimed to be drawing on either did not exist or had been conducted by an entirely different firm. The technical report was fabricated on a factual basis, even if it was assembled from a living company's documentation, and Walter spent the morning writing a detailed response to Farrow's new filing that systematically demolished every element of the claim. He delivered this response to Farrow at the hotel in person, and watched the land agent read it with the careful expression of a man calculating whether his position was tenable. "The circuit court convenes here on the 9th of May, Walter told him. "I have provided Judge Weiss with a complete record of the company's filings, both the fraudulent initial documents and the subsequent filing, along with evidence refuting the factual basis of the surveying report. At that hearing, every homestead claim in this county's southern quarter will be entered into the formal record, and their validity established under territorial law. At that point, the Continental Acquisition Company will have no legal pathway to acquisition through contest." Farrow set down the document. His face was carefully neutral. "The company has resources, martial, legal, and otherwise. So does this county," Walter said. "The difference is that we operate within the law." He left the hotel and went back to his office and found, waiting for him, a letter that had arrived in the morning mail from the territorial marshal's office. It was better than he had hoped. The territorial marshal had been receiving complaints from other counties about the Continental Acquisition Company's methods for the better part of 6 months, and the documentation Walter had provided had given him enough to formally request a territorial legislative review of the company's operating license in the Arizona Territory. While this process would take time, the territorial marshal had also communicated directly to the Continental Acquisition Company's registered legal representatives in Prescott that any further fraudulent document submissions in any territorial county would be referred immediately to the federal district court. This was the information that effectively ended Clement Farrow's mission in Redemption Creek, though Walter would not know this for certain for another 2 days. What he did on the afternoon of May 7th, after receiving the territorial marshal's letter, was to ride to the Fletcher homestead and tell Opal. He found her in the orchard, checking the peach blossoms for frost damage from the previous night, because the late spring in Arizona could be treacherous, and when she heard his horse, she came toward him between the rows of trees with her sleeves rolled up and a look on her face that was already reading his expression. He told her about the letter. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when he was done, she stood very still for a moment in the orchard with the late afternoon light filtering through the peach trees and making everything gold, and then she pressed both hands briefly over her face and breathed out. "It is not quite finished yet," he said. "The court date is still essential to formally establishing everything on record. But the worst of it is over," she said, lowering her hands. "The worst of it is over." She looked at him, and in her eyes there was the particular kind of relief that comes after a long, sustained effort of will finally reaches solid ground. But there was something else there too, something that was looking at him rather than at the situation, and Walter Sutton, who had told himself he would wait until it was done, found that the distinction between the worst being over and the thing being fully finished was one his patience was not equipped to maintain. "Opal," he said. "Walter," she said, at exactly the same time. They both stopped. She laughed, that real, bright laugh, and the sound of it in the gold orchard light was completely undoing. He stepped toward her and she stepped toward him, and his hands found her face, and when he kissed her it was with the full weight of 6 weeks of restrained certainty, and she kissed him back with the same. When they stopped, she had her hands against his chest and he had his forehead against hers, and the peach trees moved gently in the warm desert wind around them. "I have wanted to do that for a long time," he said. "You were very patient," she said. "I was trying to be appropriate." "You can stop trying so hard," she said, and there was laughter in her voice and warmth in her eyes, and Walter thought that he was going to spend a considerable amount of the rest of his life finding reasons to make her laugh. Judge Harlan Weiss arrived in Redemption Creek on the 9th of May on the afternoon stage. A compact, energetic man of 58 with a full white beard and the rapid, comprehensive intelligence of someone who had been navigating legal complexity in the territories for 20 years. Walter met him at the stage depot and spent an hour going through the documentation with him over supper at the hotel, and the judge reviewed everything with the focused efficiency of a man who had read a great deal of Walter's preparatory brief on the 3-day ride from his previous stop on the circuit. "The fraudulent documents alone would be grounds for a contempt finding against the company," Weiss said. "But what you have given me is better than that. You have given me a pattern of conduct that establishes deliberate and systematic fraud. Combined with the territorial marshal's communication, this court can not only establish the validity of these homestead claims, but can issue a formal finding that prevents the company from making any further filings against them without territorial legislative authorization." "That is exactly what we need," Walter said. "Your preparation has been thorough, Marshal, more thorough than most." "The people involved deserved thorough," Walter said. The hearing was held on the morning of the 10th of May in the Redemption Creek Courthouse, which also served as the town hall and on special occasions the community church, and it was attended by every one of the affected property owners and a significant portion of the rest of the town's population besides. Clement Farrow was present with his associate Davis, and they sat on the respondent's side with the expressions of men who have run the numbers and do not like the result. Walter sat at the petitioner's table with the property owners arranged behind him, and Opal sat directly at his shoulder, because she was the lead petitioner, and because, as she had pointed out with complete accuracy when the seating arrangement was being discussed, her claim was the most comprehensively documented, and therefore the most strategically important to establish first. He was aware of her at his shoulder throughout the entire proceeding with an attention that was not strictly professional and that he did not attempt to suppress. Judge Weiss was efficient and precise. He called each property owner in turn, established the validity of their filing, entered it into the formal record, and methodically dismantled the Continental Acquisition Company's contested claims using the documentation Walter had compiled. When Farrow's associate Davis attempted to enter the second set of company documents into evidence, the judge asked 3 questions about the surveying report that Davis could not answer, and the documentation was rejected on grounds that its factual basis could not be supported. The hearing took 4 hours. At the end of it, Judge Weiss issued a finding that established the validity of all 6 homestead claims, found that the Continental Acquisition Company had submitted fraudulent documentation in its initial filing, and issued an injunction preventing any further filing against the specified properties without prior territorial court authorization. He further noted, for the formal record, that his findings would be forwarded to the territorial marshal's office in support of the ongoing review of the company's operating license. Clement Farrow and Davis left Redemption Creek on the afternoon stage the same day, and Walter watched them go from the courthouse steps with Opal standing beside him, and the feeling of it was the particular deep satisfaction of a thing done right being completed. Harold Dunbar shook Walter's hand so hard his shoulder ached. Rosa Ortega hugged Opal and said something in rapid Spanish that made Opal smile. Silas Pemberton, who was not a demonstrative man, nodded once at Walter with an expression that conveyed everything. The Kellerman children ran between the adults' legs with the complete indifference to momentous legal proceedings that children between the ages of 5 and 9 universally exhibit. That evening, the town of Redemption Creek did what small towns do when something worth celebrating has happened, which was to gather at the largest available indoor space, in this case the hotel dining room, and eat and drink and talk too loudly and stay too late. Judge Weiss held court in the best sense of the phrase, telling stories from 20 years of circuit riding that were worth every minute of their telling. Walter ate more of the hotel cook's roast beef than was strictly dignified and talked with people he had known for 10 years and felt the satisfaction of a community that had held together under pressure. He and Opal found themselves, sometime after 9 o'clock, standing together at the edge of the gathering with plates of pie that neither of them was entirely focused on eating. "It is done," she said. "It is done." She looked at him sidelong with a smile that held nothing back. "You said when it was done." "I did. Is now sufficiently when." He took both their plates and set them on the nearest table and said, "Would you do me the honor of a walk?" They walked out of the hotel into the May night, and Redemption Creek's main street was quiet and warm, and the stars were out in their full Arizona abundance, and they walked without particular destination, side by side, not holding hands yet but close enough that their arms brushed with each step. "I want to call on you properly," he said. "I want to do this in the right order, with whatever amount of patience and formality you require." "I have been running a farm alone for 2 years," she said. "I have a fairly flexible relationship with formality. Nevertheless," she stopped walking and turned to face him, and in the starlight her eyes were dark and very clear. "Walter, I know what you are and I know what you are not. I know what you have done and why you did it. I am not a woman who needs to be courted by a man who has already shown me his character." She paused. "But I would like the walking and the supper and the proper calling, not because I need it but because I would enjoy it." "Then you will have it," he said, and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked the length of Redemption Creek's main street in the warm May night and talked about nothing consequential and everything important. Over the 6 weeks that followed, Walter Sutton called on Opal Fletcher with a regularity that was the source of considerable satisfaction to the entire town of Redemption Creek, which had opinions on the subject that its residents expressed with the frank communal interest of a small community that has invested itself in a developing situation. Martha Dunbar said to her husband that it was about time, and had been obvious for weeks. The hotel proprietor, a cheerful man named George Beale, began setting a second coffee cup at Walter's usual table without being asked. The three women who ran the general store and haberdashery had a series of conversations in voices that dropped whenever Walter walked past that he chose to find endearing. He rode out to the Fletcher homestead on Wednesday afternoons and Sunday mornings, and on the Wednesdays he helped with whatever needed doing, because there was always something that needed doing on a working farm, and the work was honest and satisfying, and gave them both something to do with their hands while they talked. On the Sundays he arrived in time for church, because Opal attended the Methodist services held in the schoolhouse on alternate Sundays, and they sat together in a way that was quietly public, and therefore publicly acknowledged in the manner these things were acknowledged. They talked about everything. They talked about the future of the territory and what statehood would mean when it eventually came, which was not entirely a distant prospect in 1882. They talked about the railroad, and whether its approaching reach would be good or dangerous for a county like theirs. They talked about their families back east in Missouri, both of whom had been dead for some years, and the particular freedom and orphan's loneliness that came with having no one to answer to and no one to go home to. They talked about what they wanted. Walter wanted, he discovered in the process of articulating it to her, what he had been building toward for 10 years without entirely knowing it. He wanted to stay in Redemption Creek, in this specific place, with these specific people, for the rest of his working life, and he wanted to watch it grow and help it grow and see what it became. He had spent his 20s moving through hard country doing hard work, and it had been worth doing, but it had not been enough. And what it had not been was this, rooted and purposeful, and connected to a community that was genuinely his. Opal wanted her farm to be what she could see it becoming, which was substantially more than it currently was. She had plans, actual plans with soil maps and water calculations and draft sketches of an expanded barn, and laying them out on the kitchen table for Walter to look at was an experience he found genuinely illuminating, because the specificity and intelligence of what she had mapped out made it clear that she had not simply been surviving the last 2 years, but had been building toward something precise. "You would need capital for the barn expansion," he said, looking at the plans. "I have been saving. By next spring I will have enough. The orchard is already producing at what rate?" she told him, in numbers that were more specific than he had expected. He looked at the plans and at her sitting across the table from him and said, "You do not need a partner for this. It is already working." "I know," she said. "I do not need a partner. That is an entirely different question from whether I want one." The summer settled in over Redemption Creek with the relentless heat that characterized the Arizona territory from June through September, and Walter and Opal moved through it with the developing ease of two people who have discovered they fit well together. He was steady where she sometimes drove herself too hard. She was warm and specific where he sometimes defaulted to practical efficiency. They argued twice in the first month. Once about a decision she had made about the cattle that he thought was wrong, and once about a man in town who had been causing low-level problems that she thought he was handling too patiently. And both arguments were direct and complete, and resolved in ways that left them understanding each other better rather than more carefully. In July, Walter Sutton came to the Fletcher homestead on a Wednesday afternoon, with the specific intention of saying something he had been organizing in his mind for several weeks. He found Opal in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled and her hair loose, transplanting seedlings with focused attention, and he dismounted and tied his horse and walked over to the fence and leaned on the top rail and watched her for a moment. She looked up and saw his expression and sat back on her heels and tilted her head slightly to one side. "You have something to say," she observed. "Yes." "Then say it." He came through the gate and crouched down to her level, because this was not a conversation for one person to be standing and one person to be kneeling in the dirt, and took both her hands in his, garden dirt and all, and said, "I love you." I have been trying to find a less abrupt way to say it, and there does not seem to be one, so I am saying it directly. Opal looked at him for a moment with those clear green eyes, and then she said, "I love you too. I have been waiting for you to say it first because it seemed like something you needed to say first." "Why?" "Because you needed to be sure. You are a man who does not say things he does not mean, and you take longer to be sure than most people, and I was willing to wait for you to get there." He looked at her, this extraordinary woman kneeling in her garden with dirt on her hands and sunlight on her face, and felt the full and complete weight of his good fortune. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am not asking yet because I want to ask properly with the appropriate preparation, but I want you to know that is where this is going, so you can tell me now if it is not where you wish to go." She smiled, the real bright smile that he had been collecting since April. "It is where I wish to go," she said. "Take whatever time you need to ask properly." He asked properly 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening in August when the worst of the heat had broken into a warm, breathable evening, sitting on the porch of the Fletcher homestead with the desert sky turning colors behind them. He did not have a ring yet, because the nearest jeweler was in Tucson, and he had already sent a letter requesting something he had described in careful detail. But he had a letter from the county clerk confirming that a marriage license could be issued on demand, which was perhaps the most romantic document he had ever assembled. He asked her to marry him. She said yes before he had finished the sentence, and then laughed at herself for it, and then said it again more completely, and Walter kissed her under the August Arizona sky with the desert cooling around them, and felt the kind of happiness that is not a feeling but a state of being. They were married on the 14th of September, 1882, in the Redemption Creek schoolhouse, which had been decorated by what appeared to be most of the female population of the county with wildflowers, and the particular creative energy of a community that had been anticipating this event for months. Judge Weiss happened to be passing back through on his return circuit and performed the ceremony with evident personal satisfaction. Martha Dunbar cried throughout. Clarence, who had put on a jacket for the occasion that appeared to be approximately 40 years old, sat in the front row with an expression of deeply dignified emotional investment. George Beale from the hotel had contributed a wedding supper that represented a significant portion of his best provisions, and the gathering afterward lasted well into the night. Walter had been living in a set of rooms above the marshal's office, which were perfectly adequate for a single man and completely inadequate for anything else. They had decided that they would live on the homestead, which made more practical sense than trying to relocate a working farm, and Walter rode into town each morning for his duties and returned each evening, which was a distance of less than 4 miles, and required no adjustment that a man with a good horse could not manage. The homestead became, very quickly, what it had always been to Opal, but was now also something to Walter, his home in the full and specific sense of the word. He was useful on the farm, which he had not expected to be quite as useful as he turned out to be. He had grown up working land in Missouri and had not done so in some years, but the knowledge came back in the muscles and in the assessment of weather and soil and water, and Opal's plans for the property were sound enough that working toward them felt meaningful rather than just physically demanding. In January of 1883, Opal told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper directly, in the manner in which she told him everything, and Walter sat for a moment with the information and the full weight of what it meant, and then stood up and took her hands and said very little but with a completeness that she understood entirely. Their son was born in September of 1883, a strong, demanding child they named James Thomas Sutton, James for Walter's father who had died when Walter was 16, and Thomas for Opal's husband who had died young and who she wished to honor without diminishing the life that was going forward. Walter held his son for the first time on a warm September afternoon, with the same desert light coming through the windows that had been there for all of this, and the feeling of it was beyond the adequate reach of language. James was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions loudly expressed, which Opal found amusing, and Walter found a mirror of nothing so much as his own mother's account of him as an infant. He had Opal's green eyes and Walter's dark hair, and an absolute confidence in the validity of his own desires that suggested he was going to be either a marshal or a lawyer, and quite possibly both. The Continental Acquisition Company never returned to Redemption Creek or the surrounding county. The territorial legislative review that had been initiated in response to the complaints of multiple counties resulted, in early 1883, in the company's operating license in the Arizona Territory being suspended pending a full audit of their land acquisition methods. Several of the company's executives faced federal charges for fraud and document fabrication in territories across the Southwest, and the company itself dissolved and reorganized under a different name before the year was out, which reorganization did not prevent the legal proceedings against its principals from continuing. Walter knew the final outcome through the territorial marshal's office dispatch, and he read it at his desk one February morning, and thought about Clement Farrow's face as the papers fell into the Main Street dust, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a thing having gone the way it should have gone. Clement Farrow himself, it emerged, had been cooperative with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced liability, which suggested that some of his nervousness on that April day in Redemption Creek had been not merely professional but personal, and that he had known very well that the documents he was presenting were fraudulent, and had been significantly uncertain about what the consequences of that would be if a marshal with Walter Sutton's thoroughness examined them closely. The Dunbar family stayed on their land. The Kellermans stayed. The Ortegas expanded their acreage the following spring by purchasing a parcel that came available when a neighboring homesteader moved further west, and Rosa Ortega brought a bushel of peaches from the new trees she planted to the Sutton homestead as a celebration of it. Old Silas Pemberton died in the winter of 1884, peacefully, and on his own land, which was how he had always said he intended to go. Redemption Creek grew slowly but purposefully through the 1880s. The railroad reached a depot point 12 miles north of town in 1884, which brought new commerce and new people, and the particular complexity of a community in transition. Walter navigated it with the combination of firmness and fairness that had characterized his tenure for 10 years already, and the county expanded his jurisdiction twice to encompass the growing surrounding area, which meant more work and a deputy, a young man named Cruz Ortega, who was Rosa and Felipe Ortega's eldest son, and who had Walter's thorough, patient approach to law enforcement and a natural gift for reading people. Opal's orchard expanded to include 2 additional rows of peach trees and a section of pears. The barn she had planned was built in the spring of 1884 with the combined labor of half a dozen neighboring families who came for a barn raising on a Saturday and stayed for the food she prepared, which was the traditional form of payment and a good one. The kitchen garden was extended to include enough productive capacity that she sold surplus at the general store in town, and the quality of her preserves was such that George Beale at the hotel became a regular purchaser. In the summer of 1885, Opal told Walter she was expecting again. She told him in the kitchen again, because that was where they talked about everything important, and this time he was not still but immediately moved to her and pulled her close and held her for a long moment. Their daughter was born in February of 1886, a winter baby, quieter from the first hour of life than her brother had ever been, with an air of focused observation that made the attending doctor say he had never seen a newborn who appeared to be taking notes. They named her Clara Margaret, Clara because Opal had always loved the name, and Margaret for Walter's mother. James, who was 2 1/2 and had strong opinions about most things, inspected his sister with the air of someone evaluating a new piece of equipment, and then announced that she could stay, which Walter and Opal agreed was the most gracious possible reception. By 1886 and 1887, Walter and Opal Sutton were a fixed and essential part of Redemption Creek's life in the way that people who have been somewhere long enough and worked hard enough and cared consistently enough become. They were the couple people sought out when there was a serious problem to address, not because of Walter's badge, though that was part of it, but because both of them had the quality of being genuinely present to whatever was in front of them. Opal served on the school board when it was formally established in 1886, and then the library committee when a library was organized the following year from donated books, and she did both with the same practical effectiveness she brought to everything. Walter was offered twice positions of greater prestige and considerably greater pay in larger towns in the territory. The first offer came from a growing city to the north that needed a marshal with his particular combination of legal thoroughness and community standing. He turned it down. The second came through a contact in the territorial government who suggested he would be a strong candidate for territorial marshal when the position next came open. He thought about that one for 2 evenings. He talked it over with Opal, who listened carefully and asked the right questions and made no attempt to influence the outcome in either direction. "What do you want?" she asked. "This," he said, meaning the kitchen table and the lamp and the sounds from the children's room and the farm outside in the dark and the town 4 miles away. "This is what I want." "Then that is your answer," she said. He turned down the territorial marshal position and did not regret it, and Redemption Creek went on expanding around them in the good, steady way of a place that has found its character and is building on it. The spring of 1888 brought a new problem that was not a secret betrayal or a hidden scheme, but the straightforward cruelty of nature, which was a late frost in April that came down hard and unexpected and damaged the orchard significantly. Walter rode out from the far north of the county, where he had been dealing with a boundary dispute when the frost hit, and arrived home to find Opal in the orchard in the early morning cold, assessing the damage with the same calm thoroughness she had always brought to difficulty. She had already identified which trees were recoverable and which were not, and had started pruning the damaged sections before the cold could set in further. They worked together in the April cold for 3 hours, and the children worked beside them, James old enough at 4½ to be genuinely useful with the lighter branches, Clara at 2 managing mostly to hand tools from one place to another with enormous seriousness. By noon, they had done what could be done, and the assessment was that they would lose significant production from the orchard that year but had saved most of the permanent stock, and the following year would recover. Opal did not mourn the loss. She made the calculation, adapted the plan for the year, and moved forward, and watching her do it was one of those moments that Walter stored away in the place where he kept the things that mattered most, next to the first time he had heard her laugh, and the day she had pressed her hand against his arm in the orchard, and the evening she had said yes on the September porch. By the end of the 1880s, James Sutton was old enough to show the particular traits that would define him, which were an absolute memory for facts and a gift for finding the exact words to say a thing clearly and without excess, both of which he had inherited from his father in recognizable form, and a warmth of manner and a habit of reading people accurately that he had from his mother in equal measure. He attended the Redemption Creek School with an unsurprising proficiency that his teacher reported, with a frequency that Walter tried not to find excessively satisfying. Clara was a quieter, but not less formidable personality. She had a gift for the visual and the spatial that showed itself in an early capacity for drawing that was notably beyond what a child her age typically produced. Careful observational sketches of the farm and its animals, and the people around her that Opal preserved in a dedicated folder with the same care she gave to legal documents. In 1889, Arizona Territory began moving more seriously toward statehood, a process that would take more than 2 decades to complete, but that was already reshaping the legal and institutional landscape of the territory in ways that Walter's work engaged with directly. The legal structures were growing more sophisticated, the courts more standardized, and the law itself becoming less provisional and more established. And Walter Sutton grew with all of it, doing the continuing education that the changes required, maintaining the connections with the territorial marshal's office that kept him current with every development. He received, in 1889, a formal letter of commendation from the territorial marshal's office for his handling of the Continental Acquisition Company case in 1882, which was being cited in the broader federal proceedings as an example of effective local law enforcement response to corporate fraud. He read it at his desk and felt the satisfaction of it, and then thought about the papers falling into the main street dust and Opal standing in her orchard in the afternoon light, and understood that the commendation was the least important part of that story. Opal read the letter that evening and said that they should frame it, which they did, and it hung in the marshal's office on the wall behind his desk for the rest of his tenure, next to a county map and a photograph of the family taken by the traveling photographer who came through Redemption Creek every 2 years. The photograph showed Walter and Opal with James between them and Clara in Opal's arms, all 4 of them in the afternoon light in front of the homestead, and it was the most accurate possible visual record of what Walter Sutton's life had become, which was the kind of life that required no memorial beyond itself. In the early spring of 1890, Opal came to his office in town, which she did occasionally, and sat across his desk and told him she thought she was expecting again. She was 35, and she said it with the mixture of joy and assessment that was purely characteristic of her, already calculating the practical implications while entirely present to the happiness of it. Their second son was born in November of 1890, a November child with Opal's auburn hair, and a set of lungs that left no one in the household uncertain about his preferences at any time. They named him Henry Clarence, Henry for no particular precedent but because both of them liked it, and Clarence for the old ranch hand who had been with the property since before any of them and who wept openly at the naming and was the better for it. Clarence himself died peacefully in the spring of 1891, on the homestead he had worked for 30 years, and they buried him in the small cemetery south of town with the proper respect of a man who had been loyal and good and had chosen his place and stayed in it. Walter spoke at the burial, briefly and well, and Opal put flowers from the orchard on the grave, and the Ortega family came, and the Dunbars, and most of the people who had been part of the community long enough to have known him. Henry Clarence Sutton grew up with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness in approximately equal measure, and was from the first months of his life the kind of child who, if he wanted something, simply continued wanting it with absolute consistency, until the universe reorganized itself around his wishes, which Walter recognized as a trait he was not entirely qualified to argue with. By 1892, the Sutton homestead was a thriving 40-acre property with an orchard that had fully recovered from the 1888 frost and was producing at a level that had moved from personal use into genuine commercial relevance. The herd had grown from Opal's original 12 to 43 head, which was a substantial increase that had required the additional pasture fencing and water management that Walter and Opal had worked out over several seasons of careful planning. The barn was solid and weathered into the landscape. The kitchen garden supplied half the town in preservation season. Walter continued as marshal through the early 1890s, and his work continued to be the combination of law and community and human navigation that had defined it since the beginning. The county was more complex than it had been in 1882, larger in population and in the variety of its disputes, and the work required more of everything, more deputies, more coordination with the territorial courts, more engagement with the increasingly sophisticated legal environment of a territory moving toward statehood. He was 50 years old in 1898, and the question of how much longer he wished to continue came up in the way that such questions come up for men who have been doing the same essential work for a long time, not as a crisis, but as a gradual shifting of the balance. He talked about it with Opal over the course of several months, in the way they talked about everything, and what emerged was not a plan but a direction, a movement toward a transition that would not be abrupt but would be intentional. Cruz Ortega had been his deputy for 12 years and was, by this point, as competent a lawman as Walter had encountered in a career spent evaluating competent lawmen. He knew the county as well as Walter did, spoke both English and Spanish with equal fluency in a county where both were needed, and had the particular combination of firmness and community investment that the position demanded. Walter began, in 1898, the process of preparing Cruz for the marshal's position, doing it openly and with the county commissioner's knowledge and approval, and doing it with the same thoroughness he had brought to every professional obligation for the past 25 years. James Sutton, at 15, was already reading law by this time, with the focused appetite for it that suggested his father's assessment of his probable future had been accurate. He was going to be a lawyer. He had decided this at approximately 12 years old and had been working toward it with steadiness ever since, corresponding through the county judge with lawyers in Prescott who were willing to conduct a remote preliminary legal education. Walter watched this with a pride that he made periodic efforts to keep proportionate and did not fully succeed. Clara, at 12, had begun selling her drawings through the general store with an entrepreneurial matter-of-factness that was entirely her mother's approach applied to art, and had already acquired a regular clientele among the newer families in town who wanted visual records of their homesteads and did not have access to a photographer. Henry, at 7, was still primarily interested in cattle and horses, and the specific question of where the best fishing holes in the creek were, which was an entirely reasonable set of priorities for a 7-year-old boy in the Arizona Territory. In the fall of 1899, Walter Sutton formally handed over the Marshal Star of Redemption Creek County to Cruz Ortega at a ceremony that the town made into an occasion of the kind that Redemption Creek had always been good at, communal and warm and marked by food and speech, and the particular feeling of a community acknowledging its own continuity. Walter spoke briefly and well, as he always did, and Cruz spoke with the combination of formality and genuine emotion that the occasion required, and Opal sat in the front row with Henry on her lap and watched her husband do this with an expression that Walter could read from the front of the room clearly. She was proud of him. Not for the work he was stepping away from, though she had always been proud of that, but for the way he was stepping away from it, with the same deliberate integrity he had brought to everything. After the ceremony, walking back to the homestead in the autumn evening, Walter took Opal's hand, which was not a gesture he needed a particular occasion for but which he did with a conscious completeness on this evening. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Good," he said, and then strange but good. "You will not miss it. I will miss parts of it. I will not miss the paperwork." She laughed, and the sound of it in the fall evening was the same as it had been in the April schoolhouse in 1882, bright and real and unself-conscious, and Walter Sutton was 51 years old and had been in love with this woman for 17 years and had been married to her for 17 of those years and had never for one single day taken either fact for granted. "What comes next?" she asked. "The farm," he said, "and watching James become a lawyer. And finding out what Henry decides to do about the fishing holes. Clara's commission from that family in Tucson comes through next month," Opal said. "She is going to want to go to Tucson to see the site. She should go. We will take her." Opal leaned into his shoulder slightly as they walked, and the homestead came into view ahead of them with the kitchen light on, and the sound of Henry's voice from somewhere inside arguing a point, with the specific conviction of a child who has decided the facts support his position. And the orchard was full of the last of the autumn apples, and the cattle were settled in the evening pasture, and the stars were beginning to come out over the Arizona desert in the particular brilliant abundance that had marked every important evening of Walter Sutton's life in this place. In 1900, James Sutton went to Prescott to complete his legal training, and the house was quieter with him gone in the way that houses become quieter when their oldest children leave, not diminished but reconfigured. He wrote letters home with the regularity of someone who understood that communication was a form of care, and the letters were literate and specific and occasionally very funny, and Opal kept them tied with ribbon in the same way she kept every document of significance. Clara went to Tucson and came back with her commission completed and 3 additional ones contracted, and it became clear to both Walter and Opal that their daughter was going to make a genuine life from her work, which should not have surprised either of them, but was still a specific pleasure to observe taking its shape. She stayed in Redemption Creek for the time being, building her clientele and her reputation, and talked about the future with the focused, deliberate manner that suggested she was building towards something specific without yet being ready to name it. Henry grew into his cattle and his horses and his creek with the ease of a boy who has found his element young, and at 12 was already more useful on the farm than many grown men Walter had known, with an eye for the land that came from being inside it from birth. Walter taught him everything he knew about the property and the water and the seasonal cycles, and the teaching was as satisfying as anything he had done, because Henry received it not as instruction but as conversation, asking questions that showed he was building a genuine understanding rather than memorizing rules. In the spring of 1901, James Sutton came home from Prescott as James Sutton, attorney at law, and the celebration of it lasted the better part of a week, and involved a dinner that Opal cooked for 22 people, and a speech from Walter that caused James to look at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a young man managing his emotions, which was recognizably his father's expression, and which made Opal laugh and press her hand over her mouth. James set up a law practice in Redemption Creek, which needed one and had not had one, and built it with the steady thoroughness that was his temperament and his inheritance. He was 20 years old and looked more like Walter every year and had, already, the particular quality of attention that his father had always had, the quality of being fully present to what was in front of him, which Opal said was the most important thing Walter had ever taught anyone. Walter Sutton, in the spring of 1901, was 53 years old and had been in Redemption Creek for 23 years, and had been married to Opal Fletcher Sutton for almost 19 of them, and the life they had built together on the 40 acres south of town was everything that the young man who had arrived in this county in the late 1870s had not known he was looking for but had built, step by deliberate step, into the realest thing he had ever known. The orchard was in bloom in April, the peach and apple trees white and pink against the blue Arizona sky, and Opal was in it one afternoon when Walter came home from the former marshal's office, where he still occasionally consulted for Cruz Ordega on particularly complex legal questions, and he stopped at the fence and watched her walking the rows of trees with that easy familiar certainty of a woman who knows every tree by name and history. She saw him and came toward him through the blossoms, and he opened the gate for her and she came through it and looked up at him with those green eyes that had not changed in 20 years except to be more themselves. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," he said. They stood for a moment in the April light, the orchard behind her and the homestead behind him, and the life they had made together spread out in all directions from where they stood. He put his arm around her and they walked toward the house, and from inside they could hear Henry's voice and Clara's voice in some ongoing discussion that was part of the texture of their days, and the smell of something cooking drifted out through the open kitchen window, and the afternoon light lay long and gold across the Arizona land that was theirs. Walter Sutton had come to this county as a marshal with a badge and a purpose, and had found, in the process of doing his work with everything he had, a woman who was his match in every particular, and a home that was genuinely his, and a life that was worth every morning it required. And Opal Fletcher had stood in a marshal's doorway with a folder of documents and all her fear carefully contained, and had found, in the man who looked up from his desk and took her situation seriously, not a rescuer but an equal, which was the only kind of partner she had ever had any use for. The Continental Acquisition Company was a memory. The fraudulent papers had long since blown away from the Main Street dust where Walter had let them fall. Clement Farrow was somewhere in the East, presumably employed in some other form of useful dishonesty, and the families of Redemption Creek's southern quarter were on their land, their claims established, their futures intact. And the proud marshal who had told the land agent exactly what he was, and exactly what was required of him, had ridden home that afternoon in the April dust to tell a woman with green eyes and auburn hair and 40 acres that her claim was valid and her fight was not over and she would not face it alone, and had not known then entirely how far the implications of that afternoon would reach. He knew now. He knew on every ordinary afternoon and every extraordinary morning and every quiet evening on the porch with the desert stars coming out, and his wife's voice, and his children's voices, and the sound of the farm settling into the night around him. He had done the right thing in the street in front of his office in April of 1882, and it had been the right thing for the law and for the county, and for every family whose claim had been protected, and all of that was true and real and sufficient justification on its own. But it had also been the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to him, which was Opal Fletcher turning those green eyes on him across his own desk, and deciding that he might be worth trusting. And it turned out that he was, and she was, and they were, and the life that followed was the proof of all three. On the porch of the Sutton homestead in the spring of 1901, with the orchard in bloom and the cattle in the evening pasture and the children inside, and the stars coming out over the Arizona desert, Walter Sutton and Opal Sutton sat side by side in the warm May dark, and his hand was in hers, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. The desert night settled around them, warm and vast and full of stars, and Redemption Creek lay quiet a few miles to the north, and the 40 acres that Opal had refused to surrender, and Walter had refused to let be taken lay peaceful and certain around them in the dark, and everything was exactly as it should be, and nothing was unresolved, and nothing important had been left unsaid. And the life they had built from a marshal's doorway and a folder of documents, and a set of papers falling into the Main Street dust, was whole and standing, and entirely their own.